All right. Right. I see that people are joining. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are connecting. Let's give it a minute for more people to join us for today's webinar, Starting Over, a new strategy for US military integration. Um, all right, so I will start with some housekeeping rules as usual. I am sure that most of you already know us and are regular attendees of our webinars. If you don't, we are UDIS InfoLab. I am Maria Giovanna Sessa, Research Manager at the UDIS InfoLab, and we are a nonprofit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe. We organize, among other things, these webinars almost on a weekly basis in order to give voice to experts in our community, to share knowledge, and to raise awareness around the excellent work that is being done by so many in our community. As you might have noticed, the webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and our website. There is also a captions and translation option. You can click on CC at the bottom of your screen and enable the translation option, picking the language you prefer. And we're also going to have, as usual, a Q&A session after the presentation, but also in this case, some interaction during the presentation, and we will be using Slido, not Zoom chat. So I invite you to already scan the QR code on the screen or to go to slido.com and enter the code disinfo. And I also urge you to submit your questions anytime. Do not wait until the end of the presentation so we can start collecting them and answering them right away. To get you familiarized with the Slido, let's start asking our usual questions to break the ice. Let us know which sector do you represent of this very diverse community. We have a lot of NGO, civil society, but also academia is growing, business is following, and some other more general category. Keep on posting your questions, your answers, sorry. And in the meantime, let us also know where you are joining us from. I am based in Italy. Our speaker today is from the US, as the title of the webinar might have given away. So, Italy, big representation. We have Brussels, Madrid, Bucharest, but also New York, Boston, Iceland, Austria. Fantastic. Welcome, welcome, everyone. So, now that we're done with this more general housekeeping and introduction, let's delve into today's topic. We will discuss how the United States government has chosen to unilaterally disarm its information integrity instruments, which left Americans, but also world citizens, more vulnerable to manipulation, interference, and disinformation. But don't worry, it's not all gloomy because we will discuss a new resilience strategy for the US integrity ahead of us. And I'm sure that this will also offer a lot of food for thought, even for those of us outside of the US. So today's speaker navigating us through this important topic is Adam Fivenson, who researches and writes on democracy, technology, and the information environment with an aim to drive innovation in democratic practice around the world. He has over 20 years of experience, and I'm sure that he will mention himself some of his previous roles. He is now a non-resident fellow at the American University Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. So welcome, Adam, and thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours, and I will see you later for the Q&A.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Maria. Let me just share my screen here. All right. And oops. There we go. Is that working? Or Maria, do you See my presentation?
Yes, it's
All
working.
right. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much to EU Disinfo Lab and to Maria for hosting me. I'm so excited to be here to talk about this topic. I think it's a really critical one, especially at a time like this. Presentation is called Starting Over, a new strategy for U.S. information integrity. So, a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today. This is a serpentine agenda image here, but we'll have a brief introduction. We'll talk about what happened to US-based info integrity efforts over the last few years and what kind of led us to the moment that we're in now. We'll talk about how the information environment is changing and why that matters to this moment and this narrative. Then we'll talk a little bit about what the US strategy was actually doing in this space. We'll talk about the cuts and what the impact may be, what that looks like right now, or what we know at the moment. And then we'll talk a bit about the strategy piece. What were the challenges with what we were doing before? And finally, where might we go from here? And so I'll try to zip through the first few slides so we can really get to those last questions of what were the challenges and where might we go from here. But first, a bit about me. I am a fellow with the Center for Security Innovation and New Technology at American University with Samantha Bradshaw and Dean Jackson, great friends of mine. If you don't know their work, please check it out. Dean is a writer with Tech Policy Press, and Samantha publishes regularly on this topic. I also run a small boutique consulting firm called Fivenson Global. That's relatively new. And up until a few months ago, I led research with the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which is the think tank within the National Endowment for Democracy that's focused on authoritarian influence. And then prior to that, I was with a group called DAI that does a lot of work in the USAID space. I taught at Georgetown for a little while. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic some years ago. And I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan, which is tremendously important to mention. And for those in the States, you'll know it's a sad week for us. We lost the big game over the weekend to Ohio State, but we've always got next year. So anyway, moving on. A few notes before we get into the actual presentation here. First, I want to acknowledge that my perspective is very much a US perspective based on my experience sitting here in Washington, visiting and talking to friends all around the world, traveling around the world and working on this issue and talking to folks in other regions. But at the end of the day, I live here and my perspective is shaped by my experience and my cultural and social and political environment. So I just want to acknowledge that out in front, but I really try my very best in all the work that I do to bring a global perspective. And as Maria mentioned, I spent 20 years in the international sector, and so hopefully I will, as I speak, I'll be reflecting your perspectives as well. I'm not an OSINT specialist. This presentation is based on my observations and my qualitative research primarily over the last few years and recently. And I'll just say I'm super eager for your reactions, for your engagement, for your thoughts. And I'll try to speak slowly when I get excited, as I am about this topic. I speak fast, so I will try my very best to keep things slow for everybody's sake. So, moving on. All right. What happened to US-based info integrity efforts over the last few years? I made this handy-dandy little timeline in Gemini. I've been experimenting with some of the tools in there, and I find it really useful. So just I'll walk you through what's on here. This is my assessment of it. Some folks might go back further than 2022, which would be reasonable. Some folks would go back to 2014 and say, well, we should start with Russia's full-scale, or rather with Russia's initial invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Some folks say 2016, after the US election that brought the first Trump administration in, and platforms started to staff up around trust and safety. Some folks would start with the full-scale invasion in 2022. I think all those things are relevant, but for the U.S. situation, I want to start in 2022 with what were called the Twitter files and the sort of debut of this narrative of a censorship industrial complex. And essentially, what this was at the time was a journalist releasing a number of files, emails and other documents on Twitter to get attention to work that was being done to counter disinformation, to push back on lies, on manipulation, on misogyny, on hate speech, and other forms of what in democracies we understand to be harmful discourse. And essentially using those emails and those conversations to highlight folks working in this space, think tanks here in DC, research centers at universities all around the country, essentially going after them for the work that they were doing on information integrity and debuting this narrative of the censorship industrial complex, which essentially suggests that people who are working to improve the quality of information in our information environment are censoring, are silencing, alternative voices. And I think we have to keep our minds on first principles here. We know from history that harmful speech, that violent speech, that speech that targets certain groups and societies, results in very bad things. And so as a society over time, including in the US, we've done a number of things to try to incentivize, or rather disincentivize that type of discourse. And this censorship industrial complex narrative is essentially suggesting that the folks who care about that challenges and don't want racism, misogyny, and other types of harmful speech in our information environment are censoring those voices. I don't think that's the case. I would argue that what folks in this space, and I'm sure many of the people on the call, are really doing is using our free speech, our experience and understanding of the world to try to help the public understand who's lying, why they're lying, what's behind it, right? The entire ABCD, what that entire framework, to help folks understand what's happening. So anyway, 2022 was the beginning of this, narrative essentially being elevated in the public discourse in the U.S. context. And the Twitter files themselves were then used by the House Ways and Means Committee under Jim Jordan to start to go after some of those organizations. And that started with sending individual letters, and it moved on very quickly, as I see here in 2023, letters from the House Ways and Means Committee asking organizations, what are you doing? What is this work? Tell us, everyone, that at your organization is doing this work. What are the events you've organized? Asking those kinds of questions, essentially a fishing expedition. Those letters were then used to advance a series of conversations and hearings that resulted in, over the last 2 years, coming up to 2025, the closure of many of the critical research centers, such as the Stanford Internet Observatory, challenges including at the Harvard Shorenstein Center, challenges to many of the civil society organizations doing this work in the States. And that leads us up to 2025. I would argue that in 2020, we had something called the Election Information Partnership that brought a lot of those skills and experiences together, that worked to help platforms understand what was happening and identify foreign malign influence and harmful narratives on the platforms. That was essentially used to undermine those organizations and suggest that they had been, that the government, and particularly the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, had been using this platform to sort of go after one side politically. I think it's a stretch of, as I would suggest that most folks in the sector probably would agree. Again, I would argue it's a case of using our free speech and trying to defend the American public from foreign malign influence. At the same time, that was perceived differently or used to sort of justify undermining this ecosystem, the domestic ecosystem, such that by 2024, there was essentially, almost no domestically focused, not nothing, but much more meager efforts domestically to identify foreign malign influence and identify harmful speech around the 2024 election. Of course, we also had the purchase of Twitter, now X, by Elon Musk, that had some big, important effects as well. So I don't want to forget that. But essentially, 2024 was the culmination of these efforts from 2022, 2023 to lower those defenses domestically, and make it easier for Americans to be manipulated. There's a great report from the Integrity Institute that just came out, which I recommend to folks if you have a chance to check it out. It really compares the 2020 versus 2024 elections here in the U.S. and explains what some of the differences were in more detail. But all of that is prologue to 2025. And the entry of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, and as you all saw very quickly, the aid freeze, the stopping of all international aid work, the eventual closure of USAID, the shutting down of the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, the shutting down of the Foreign Malign Influence Center, or rather the Foreign Malign Influence Center within ODNI, within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI shutting down its Foreign Influence Task Force, challenges for NED, where I was, challenges for NED around around funding, around their funding. And at the same time, philanthropy sort of saying, "Oh wow, this is all of a sudden a much more contested space," and so many of the organizations in that space sort of running as fast as they can. So the broader picture of 2025, at least from a U.S. perspective, is very little domestic effort on this issue, and all of our international efforts essentially having now been cut, which doesn't make a lot of sense in some ways. The international piece, especially, was never really a key part of the discourse here domestically. So I have a lot of questions still about why going after the international apparatus was such a priority for this administration. Let's move on. So let's look a little more detail at what happened to the U.S. funding in this space, maybe some of the numbers and what we saw over the last few years here. This is the USAID Democracy, Rights, and Governance budget. It's the fiscal year 23 budget, which is the most updated version that was used or was intended to be used in the 2025 budget request. So this is about the closest we have to an actual set of numbers that look at what the U.S. was spending on this issue, agency by agency. So within USAID, the DRG Center had a budget request of 2.6 billion in 2023, which means that by 2024, coming into 2025, that was more or less the funding level that they were operating at. Of that money, about 247 million was going to independent media, about 637 million was going directly to civil society support, and about 426 million was going to human rights support. And lastly, 214 million to political competition and consensus building. So these are all longtime U.S. priorities in the international sector. The U.S. learned from World War II onward that we couldn't just build roads and airports and infrastructure for our partners, because that's great, but it doesn't actually change the trajectory of development, rights or economic outcomes, and we learned that you have to engage around rights for a society to have sustained economic growth, especially broad-based economic growth. People up and down the economic chain and the social chain have to have rights, and so that's no surprise to anyone on this call. But just in terms of why we were doing this, how it fit in with our larger efforts, USAID was a huge part of that, and all of those numbers are now zero. Now, of course, the numbers you see below inside the circles don't add up to 216 billion. There are other things the USAID DRG budget was going to. I would argue that these four are probably the most relevant for our sector and what we do. Next, within the State Department, the Global Engagement Center, they were giving international grants at around 100 million. A large segment of that was grants directly to organizations in Ukraine. The rest of it was international partners all over the globe. Again, that initiative has been completely shut down, the Global Engagement Center, which is really unfortunate, because a lot of the work that they were doing was reports on Russian and PRC info ops all over the world, but also they were researching how it was that those authoritarian powers, were trying to influence the U.S. context, including around our election. So it's a tremendous loss for that to be gone. And then the last thing I'll mention is the National Endowment for Democracy, not a government institution, but funded directly by the U.S. government. And as of earlier this year, a major donor with doing more than 2,000 grants in 100 countries related to democracy issues, not just the net, of course, but the entire family of organizations, including the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center, in addition to NED's discretionary grant budget, adds up to about 315 million total. What exact percentage of that is going to InfoSpace specific programs is, of course, difficult to define because it depends on what you consider in or out of that. But calculations that I saw, anywhere from 40 to 50% at different times. That's probably no longer the case, given how things are changing here in the U.S. But at the time, that was more or less what was going into it. So again, to draw a picture of what's been lost, all of this. I saw a number from a new report from International IDEA that came out just a few days ago, looking at the overall loss of U.S. support in the sector, which put the number at 80 billion, not for just DRG, but for overall international development or international cooperation, which is massive. We're a small slice of that. Ideally, we would be in a future situation a much larger segment of that, both the info space and the democracy work. So, all right, moving on. So, how is the information space changing? I've been using this analogy recently that, a few years ago, you might have been able to argue that this idea of disinformation or manipulated information, it was kind of an oil leak, right? It was a little bit of it was a problem. It was an important problem. And that's why, I and many others are doing this work. but we could have segregated or understood the problem to be only a small segment of what's happening in our information environment. What I would argue has been happening over the last few years, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, and explain what I mean, is that now we've gone from sort of a slow drip to being covered in it, right? I mean, this is us right now, and our information environment. We're covered in oil. It's polluted and bad, harmful. Lies and manipulation are being accelerated at pace. Some have suggested that we are now in the post-truth era. I don't know if that's entirely the case, but it certainly, to me at least, feels like in the last 2 years here, things have changed. They're accelerating, and that has a lot to do with some of these factors that I want to mention. So I would argue that there are three things behind this. One is platform changes, or rather policy changes at platforms, what I call the trust safety massacre over the last 2 to 3 years. Within major platforms, they've shut down their trust and safety teams. They've outsourced that role, so it's not an important role internally. They've shut down their civil society and academic engagement councils. They've shut down some of the programs that were meant to support trusted voices internally, and give them easy pathways to report abuse and attacks, and to be protected from those things. So many of those programs have been shut down across the social media space. Shutting down fact checking. Of course, the Meta program is the big one here. We saw the video of Mark Zuckerberg after the election suggesting that the fact checkers were, these hulking, lumbering, powerful beasts that were controlling Meta and forcing them to, have higher quality information. I would suggest that potentially that Meta, in fact, may be the hulking beast that's, behind a lot of what's happening here. And the fact checkers are folks who are doing their very best in a very challenging environment to help the public understand a little bit of what's happening and using their rights to free expression and free speech to do that. But nonetheless, Meta has, moved to shut that program down. I know that most of their U.S. partners have had their funding fully cut, and partners in other parts of the globe have been informed, at least in many cases, that their funding will be ending soon. The last piece of that, but not the only piece, is of course restricting data access, the shutting down of the open API at Twitter, the shutting down of or at least the shuttering of CrowdTangle at Meta. These are really big deals for people in the sector. It means we have much less idea of what's happening across those platforms, and it becomes that much harder to understand what changes in the platforms and evaluate them in the context of changes in society and perspective in our political sphere, and in our social environment. So all of those things I think are really critical. In addition, you could argue that there's a broader kind of alignment of the platforms as concentrated, economic power to align with political power to protect their interests. I would argue that that's a large part of what we're seeing now, especially here in the US. I also want to talk a bit about generative AI, which I would argue is a big deal. I know that there are many folks in the space who suggest, well, what's really different here? What's really changed? Is this anything new, in terms of the actual capabilities of authoritarian powers or manipulators? I think it is, to me, it's partly anecdotal that on most of my social media feeds now, at least half of my feed is now AI. But also, if you understand the technology in terms of what's changing, it's not necessarily just about deepfakes. I'm concerned about deepfakes. And last year, I put out a paper with Beatrice Saab about that issue that looked at some of those challenges, but I think also took a broader perspective and suggested that really what we're dealing with here, all of a sudden, is a system of tools that make data collection, data analysis, and the production of media, tailored media, that entire ecosystem much, much easier, much, much cheaper. The way I think of it is that, all of a sudden, Cambridge Analytica, which at the time took, maybe dozens of staff and quite a lot of money to do, you can now do that. You can collect data, build profiles of individuals, and then use that to tailor content to them, if not as individuals, as much smaller buckets of groups where the content is much better tailored to a smaller demographic or geographic or age group. You can do that much more effectively now, and you can essentially automate it, right? So, do we have evidence of that changing the result of an election? Probably not. But I'm not sure the bar of evidence needs to be that high for us to be concerned about this issue, about this new technology that I would argue is actually having a pretty big impact. And, the folks who do this research would suggest that we've moved past the ability to sort of look at what's happening on Twitter and say, oh, look at all these copy pasta accounts. They're all saying the same thing. Those are all bots. Many of the bots now evolve over time. They react to current events. They engage in conversation. It doesn't mean you can't figure out who's a bot. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it becomes a lot harder. So this creates a lot of friction on the side of the defender community, on the side of those who are concerned about information integrity, and it really accelerates the work of those trying to manipulate. I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to be using AI, actually, for what it's worth, including in my presentation here, as you'll see from most of my graphics. But let's come back to that later. The last thing I'll just mention is the geopolitical aspect of this. We know that authoritarians are increasingly collaborating in the information environment. They're collaborating in terms of ideological support. They're collaborating with technical support. They're collaborating through funding, and then direct amplification, likes, retweets, reposts, that kind of thing. At the same time, we have a deteriorating global security infrastructure or architecture that is making it much more difficult for democracies to work together. And especially around issues like this, as evidenced by the loss of USAID funding. And then lastly, I'll just mention, this idea of nationhood and identity. These are defined less and less by our physical location and the borders that surround us, and increasingly, based on the online communities that people are a part of, whether that's a Reddit group, whether it's a certain game that somebody plays, that has a massive impact on people's perception of the world and themselves. And I think all those things are really critical to how the information environment is changing. So you've got a rapidly changing information environment. That was already the case. You've got an institutional environment that is reducing resources that go to ensuring that people have access, that citizens have access to high quality information so they can make good decisions, whether it's just figuring out what medicine to give your child or who to vote for in a major election. I would argue that we're likely to see major impact, and you could argue in some contexts that we already are. I wanted to split this up into three different areas, or just geographic regions. Global majority, I understand I'm throwing a lot into one bucket, but that to me, I'm referencing Latin America, Africa, East Asia, most of the world that was receiving U.S. support. No longer are the NGOs and journalists that were doing that work in those contexts getting as much money. They might be still getting some funding from Europe or from local contexts or local partners, but they're getting much less. And that's really concerning because at a time when things are changing as rapidly as they are, we would like that to be moving in the opposite direction for obvious reasons. The rise of state-sponsored disinformation or FEMI narratives all over the globe, right? We know that especially since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, Russia has tripled down on its international efforts to both bolster its image, to undermine the perceptions of Ukraine, to undermine NATO all around the globe, not just here in US and Europe. So those are all major, major concerns. And the end result is reduced capacity for local partners, local voices who understand their communities, understand what's harmful in their communities, and are trying to provide good information. Next, in Europe, some pretty major issues. Of course, there were lots of organizations in Europe that were receiving, support from the US. No longer the case. It results in a real fragmentation of collective defenses. And that's one of the challenges I know that we're seeing right now, including in the European context. You have overlapping layers of collaboration. You have a conference every weekend on this topic that I'm so jealous of, because if I was there, I would want to be at every single one of them to see all of you and talk about this. But that becomes more difficult when all of a sudden the U.S. Departs the scene. And so, and then on the U.S. side, in many ways, the collapse of the nonprofit ecosystem that's focused on this issue and the loss of expertise. A lot of my friends, people who've been working on this issue, are finding work in other areas, are moving away from this set of issues because, they've got rent to pay. They have healthcare costs to pay, which are significant. And they've got to keep going here. So, we have, I would argue, a real change in the dynamic here in the US, where all of a sudden we have a federal government that's very willing to use intimidation to go after people and undermine public trust. And I think that the results have been very significant over the last 10 months, especially that we've seen, attacks, of course, on journalists. That's not new, but amping up attacks on any sort of external system of knowledge or authority, like our university system, like our legal system, etc. And including talk of an anti-NGO law, echoing Georgia, echoing other contexts, which is quite shocking for Americans who are very proud and accustomed to the value of free speech and free expression. So we don't know the full impact yet, I would argue. I think we can get some sense of it. Accountability Lab did a great survey on this that reached out to many organizations to ask and understand what their perceptions were, what was changing for them. I encourage folks to check that out. The Tech Global Institute has done a really interesting survey as well that's focused on internet freedom, so an adjacent community. So very worth checking out both of those initiatives to understand better what the actual impact is. But I would argue that we're seeing it now, right? And it's sort of an undermining of support to high quality information, to the journalists, the fact checkers, narrative researchers, the sociologists, the pollsters, all the groups that were kind of working together on this issue around the globe, especially in the global majority, are now really being undermined. So major issues there. I want to talk just for a moment about my perceptions of what the US was actually doing in this space. And in my mind, there's sort of three, and I sort of describe them as the Holy Trinity in a way of US support. One was direct support to independent journalism, tremendously important, something we still have to be doing, we should be doing more of. But this question of the journalistic business model, in many ways, I feel that we've been swimming upstream. And so I'll say more about that later, but I do, journalists are our white blood cells. They are our inoculation against lies and manipulation. And so, of course, they're the first things that authoritarians go after. And so in many ways, the shuttering of the US ecosystem has really affected that support around the globe. Second is fact checking. Of course, this has been an ongoing debate in our sector about how we think about fact checking. I think it's hugely important. I think that folks who are still empirically minded and want to know what's happening in the world, not just feel good about what's happening in the world, folks who want to really know so they can take action and change what's bad and what's harmful. I think fact checking is tremendously important for our community to have that first draft of history. Some would argue that maybe it's taken on an oversized role in our sector. I don't think we should be funding fact checking less. I think we should just be funding everything else more, and frankly, more for fact checking as well. I don't think we should be having to choose this very difficult choice between one or the other. We should be doing all these things and doing all of them in better coordination. But let me come back to that in a minute. And the last piece is media literacy. Again, hugely important. That's the more long-term strategy, helping folks understand how to evaluate what they read and what they see is really, really critical. In many ways, I would argue that this is something we should be integrating into education systems around the globe. I know Ukraine has examples of that in their domestic system, as do the Baltic states, which is fantastic. Maybe Finland as well. That would be ideal. In many ways, I think this is just critical thinking, right? And as education systems around the world deteriorate under increasingly authoritarian leadership, this challenge becomes greater and greater. So it ties in with the broader discourse around, well, if we were to really solve this problem, it would be something that governments around the globe would be taking action on. The last two things, though, that I want to just mention that we were doing some of, but could have been maybe doing more. One was monitor and report. Basically just, observing what's happening in the information environment and reporting that out to key actors in the space, especially in a collaborative way. And then lastly, collaboration, right? There were a number of efforts that the U.S. government was supporting in this space, both internally within the government, but especially in the civil society space, helping civil society collaborate more effectively. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but I think it's really a critical aspect of our work and something that we have to be doing a lot more of. But this is what I view the U.S. as sort of what we were doing before. And in many ways, I would argue that this set of initiatives was designed to sort of get us back to an information environment that we were familiar with, right? Re-empower the journalists, get some fact checking out there, help people understand what's happening, all really important stuff. But as we saw, it wasn't enough. And so I think that there's more here that we need to be thinking about as we move toward and fingers crossed a future situation where the US would re-engage on this topic. So I want to highlight a few of the challenges. This is a very active slide. Again, I want to thank my friend Gemini for producing such an engaging slide. I don't know if I would call these necessarily failed approaches, but what were our lessons learned from a lot of what we've been doing? And this one, of course, always comes up, the question of reactivity. What's interesting about this, I would argue, is that I don't think we're reactive by design. I think that we are reactive because those are the tools that have been provided to our sector. Proactivity in a democracy is achieved through legislation. In the US, that's tremendously difficult right now, especially on contested topics, as it has been for some time on many contested topics. And I won't dive into that in too much depth, but just to say that, part of the reason why fact checking, took on the importance that it did was that was what the platforms were willing to fund, in essence, because their business model depends on them not doing moderation up in front. It depends on the ability of an individual to blast a message out to an unlimited number of people and, within an instant all around the globe. And so the answer was to get civil society groups involved in fact checking. Again, I think it's tremendously important. They should still be doing it. But it is reactive by definition. So I don't think we should stop that. I think we should have that, but we should also be thinking proactively. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that in a few moments here. Silos. We're tremendously siloed, not just between academia, the media, and NGOs, but even within those sectors, right? I mean, we all compete with each other for funding, and that's not a bad thing. I'll say more about that in a minute, but it does create some tension in the sector. And so, we've got to find a way in this space to ensure that our efforts are, aggregate to one another, that we are collaborating and coordinating. I think a little overlap is okay. That's what my friend Jakub Kalensky suggests. What I'm worried about are gaps, right? Our countries or issue sets or response types that are not getting covered in X, Y, or Z context. A country that has an election coming up, are we sure that the journalists are working together there? Are the fact checkers working together? Are those communities, communicating with one another in advance of the election, et cetera, and frankly beyond the election? So yeah, we know that our opponents or rather the authoritarians are well networked, and they are working together very, very effectively, very quickly. One example of the speed of that support would be, what may have been coming out of the African Initiative, which is a grant program, or rather a funding program that Russia runs in Africa, that funds organizations very quickly. Even the NED, which maybe was the US's fastest mechanism, still takes, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 months, depending on when you submit your application in that cycle. And so, we were slower. They're faster, and they're more willing to experiment and innovate. So all those things are very interesting. Lastly, I think competition in many ways has overruled collaboration. So some elements of that we need to explore and figure out, from a procurement standpoint at least, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. Then lastly, our messaging. So many times our messaging has become donor focused rather than focused on our communities. And that's easy for me to say from DC, oh, you're not doing it right. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that at scale, how are we working to ensure that our partners are able to engage and be heard in the modern information environment? And I would argue we weren't doing enough. So where do we go from here? The big strategy slide, give me just 1 second. All right. So where do we go from here? I think there's a few things to start with. And for me, the number one is that we have to let go of the past. Much of the leadership and the decision-making in the US context have been led by what I would describe as old school journalists. Very good people who I have a lot of respect for, and people who I think are tremendously insightful about this issue. But people who have not spent time on TikTok, who don't know how Reddit works, who don't use these tools. And so it's hard for them to really conceptualize how the space has been changing, if you're not in those contexts. I would argue that in large part, the big difference is that good content, high quality content, is no longer the king. Content is no longer king, right? It's now about orchestration, about coordination. In the past, a really well-researched, airtight corruption investigation might have attracted a lot of attention. That's still the case in some contexts. But nowadays, you're swimming uphill if you're not collaborating and getting joint amplification of that narrative or that piece when you post it. You're probably missing opportunities to engage with folks. And so it's no longer just good content that's king in the space where we're flooded with not just messages, but channels, platforms, tools. It's harder and harder to break through. And so if we don't understand the architecture of the space and how it is that a certain narrative or story reaches people and reaches a larger audience, and I hate the term, but goes viral, then we're always going to be at a major disadvantage there. The next thing I want to point to, and others have said this, I'm not the first, right, is articulating a vision for a healthy information environment. I mean, for me, in a way, this is pretty simple. We want, more good information out there that is fact checked, that's empirical, that's related to direct challenges to the health and prosperity of citizens in democracies and frankly citizens anywhere, um, and less of the bad, less manipulation, less lies, and more localized knowledge that connects people to the information they need to make good decisions, as we were saying earlier. And of course, the devil's in the details. Defining what's good and what's bad is where this gets difficult. Determining how to actually segregate or differentiate between those two, as of course any friend who you may have that works at a platform will tell you. I think in many ways DSA and DMA are a vision of a healthy information environment. That's partly why the U.S. administration is going after the DSA, especially in close allyship with the tech companies. They don't want an example of a successful regulatory regime that governs the digital environment, the information environment successfully. They don't want Americans thinking that DSA and DMA are a good idea. And of course, I understand that they're fraught with definitional and enforcement challenges. I get that, but you did it. You created these documents, these laws, and now we're seeing how they work. And I think for the world, that's a fascinating example. I know that there are other examples in other contexts outside of Europe, but that's sort of the big one that we're all, of course, paying attention to right now. And again, to get past reactivity, it is a question of legislation. And in this country, in the U.S., we've lost consensus around this issue, which makes that question of legislation that much harder. Um, pardon me. So the next thing here along the top is to identify and cultivate new allies. And we've had to engage some expected and some unexpected allies in this kind of fight for a healthy information environment for some time. I think this has been an issue. To me, it means both deeper partnerships with adjacent communities. That's the anti-corruption community, the health community, the climate community. We're seeing a lot of action right now, I think, around climate misinformation at COP30. Those who are paying attention, I know the International Panel on the Information Environment just released a report on that topic, which to me bodes very well. I think those partnerships are really critical, even though in this new topsy-turvy world, some of those topics are also becoming more taboo. But I don't think we can bow to that. I think we have to, keep our focus on some of these issues that are ground level and that people understand. They might not understand the concept of the rule of law. They might not understand the definitions and the differences between propaganda and FEME and disinformation, but they sure know what it looks like when they see corruption and someone who's stealing their money, in a position of power. And they sure know what it means to need to make good decisions about health. And they probably are seeing climate impact, right? I mean, those are all ground level discourses that really matter. Maybe in some ways the most powerful allies right now may be the hardest ones for us to cultivate. And I think to rebuild broad salience on this issue, our sector has to re-engage some constituencies that, in many ways have been reading from a different script on this set of issues and have been fed lies about our work or just aren't aware of it. And I think to me that really means the business sector. Is a critical one. There have been some fascinating pieces published recently on why this should matter for the business sector more broadly, and why we, for businesses small and large, the ability to both, monitor and exist in a healthy information environment, of course, ties back very closely to many aspects of what works and what doesn't work in the business sector. I know that's a very broad statement, but I guess what I'm zooming in on here is in my conversations with folks in the sector, it's often an issue of reputation management and the desire to ensure that your organization's name is not being maligned, and that if your opponents or your competitors are smearing your name, then you want to know and you want to be able to respond. And I think the harder thing for the business sector and where there may be opportunity is thinking about sector-wide initiatives to build trust and rebuild trust between organizations. Those are just a little bit harder to get funding from, especially from businesses that often want to invest in things that, come back directly to the bottom line, and especially in these times as, our economies are becoming shakier. So I think that's challenging, but I don't think it's impossible. There are lots of folks in the business sector who care about this issue, both from a personal and professional standpoint. Heck, if you're managing a contract, you need to know whether or not something happened. Did they do the thing? Did they deliver the service? Did they do what they promised to do? And an information environment that doesn't enshrine truth and trust makes that a lot harder. So that's just one aspect of that. I think we need to engage more effectively with the law enforcement community. that again, needs to know whether something happened or not, whether something is true or not, to be able to do their work. Did this person commit this crime, right? I mean, that's critical to this space. And of course, we have legal systems that deal with those issues, but having an information environment that makes that all that much more difficult to understand and is mobilized to defend and protect and launder the reputations of people who maybe are taking actions that they wouldn't want the public to understand more broadly, or to smear people who are trying to support democratic values, like that's a problem, right? If you're in law enforcement. And lastly, national security. I think it's a tremendously important community that we need to be thinking about. How do we engage more effectively, with those communities, and understanding that, again, to know what's happening in the world is critical. And it can't just be a national security issue. I think the argument here, in essence, is that our community, the civil society community, has a lot to contribute from a societal perspective, more so than just from a hard intel perspective about what's happening in the world, why it matters, and most importantly, what the effective responses might be, right? Um, all right, moving on. The question of coalitions. I would argue that more so than ever, power and influence are networked in the digital age. It's less than ever about how good your work is, and more so than it is about how you use your relationships to boost it. The bad guys have figured that out, and they're doing it. They're sharing ideological, technical, financial support. They're sharing data across borders, and it's working for them. In some ways, Europe is doing this. You have overlapping layers of collaboration. But the U.S. essentially has none of it. So we need to, ideally, we'd be re-engaging on this set of issues, if not for the intimidation that we're seeing in our space right now. But beyond that, country level and regional level coalitions are also really critical. Coalitions of journalists, fact checkers, researchers, and others working on these issues in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Poland, in Moldova, right? All examples of exceptional close collaboration between organizations that probably did have some qualms and some differences, and maybe had not always been on the best terms in the past, but found ways to get past that, for the sake of the space. And so that's been a big focus of mine. I published a paper with Tim Niven from the Doublethink Lab in late last year, I believe it was November, looking at the issue of collaboration, and would encourage folks to check that out if they haven't already. A new theory of partnerships. Our opponents are running circles around us. While we're kind of in round 2 out of 5 rounds of procurement. Our current approach to government civil society partnership is too slow. It creates unhelpful competition in the space. In the digital age, there are faster, more effective ways to partner, across the spectrum. I think competition is great when a product is commoditized. In other words, when there are many suppliers and the product is standardized, so it doesn't really matter who you get it from. That is not the case in this sector. There are relatively few of us, much fewer now with the lack of U.S. support or the disappearance of U.S. support. And very few people or organizations are really doing the exact same thing. You could make an argument, okay, journalists are, are researching. There are, of course, many different types of journalists. Fact checking, maybe there's some similarities with the work that folks do, but again, people have different approaches and different ways they do that depending on the context. So, and then beyond that, I mean, there's lots of other folks who are in this space, sociologists, pollsters, academics, etc. And I think we should be encouraging that, right? We should be finding ways of engaging more effectively as a community. I'll just say that, I've always struggled in some ways to engage more deeply with the academic space. But since I've been out of the International Forum this year, have found more opportunities to do that, and I'm finding it quite fruitful. And then I'll just say on the speed, NED represents the National Endowment for Democracy, was represented the fastest mechanism for getting a grant from the U.S. On democracy issues. And again, it took 3 or 4 months. It was founded in 1983. At the time, it was like light speed. These days, it's still one of the fastest mechanisms within the U.S. ecosystem. But compared to what Russia, China, Iran and others are doing, it's, very, very slow, and not as effective. So that's something we have to rethink and reconsider. All right, and then to close up here, just some thoughts on the tactical. I think we have to get out of our boxes and go direct to the public. We have to risk being in contested spaces and leave the safety of our filter bubbles on LinkedIn and elsewhere. We all have a tendency to withdraw into our shells when things become challenging. I think that's the case right now. In many contexts, including here in the US, there is significant intimidation of civic voices that's happening. I think we can't fall into that trap. Authoritarians really thrive on our silence. They work to sever the connection between expertise and the public. That's part of the reason why they go after journalists. And it's critical for us as democratic voices. Now, I would argue to think about how we communicate with the public. And, can we sit and wait for that interview from the Washington Post or the New York Times? Or do we need to be rethinking how we engage? Yes, still write the 3,000 word paper, but your job is not done when you put it on your website and tweet once about it. Then you need to think about, how do I get this in front of folks? And part of what I'm arguing for right now is that for our sector, we should be doing vertical video training. We should be helping people get more comfortable in the new information environment. It doesn't mean everyone's got to be on TikTok. It doesn't mean everyone's got to be doing dances, etc. Although you should if you want. But it does mean that we should be lowering the barriers for our community to engage in these contested spaces instead of shying away and saying, oh no, someone might disagree with me or someone might criticize me in a bad faith way. Let them. Let's go and have that debate. Let's go and get out into the space and make the case for our work, make the case for why the truth matters, for why foreign malign influence matters. I think we should be doing that more. And there was a great piece that was written on this by Renee DiResta and Rachel Kleinfeld for the Carnegie Endowment quite recently. Highly recommend checking that out. The title, I believe, has to do with nonpartisan institutions. So really recommend checking that out. And then in terms of messaging, I think we have to return to the basics and focus on the harms of malign information campaigns, why it matters. Go beyond talking about just threats to democracy. I think that's still important. I don't argue that we should throw out the term democracy or that set of issues, but drilling into the specifics and accountability and systems of democratic support and those things, it's all really important. But in my mind, the things that people really understand are the things that matter at the kitchen table. So I think that is trying to help folks understand why an unhealthy information environment hurts their pocketbooks, it makes them less healthy, and it makes them less safe. And those are all very, very clear, and I would argue empirically proven statements. I don't feel like I'm going out on a limb saying that. And the last thing is just infrastructure thinking. Again, with our siloed approach, I think that has left us in many ways vulnerable to these attacks. If we were thinking in an infrastructure way, as we know our authoritarian adversaries are, and I highly recommend the third European External Action Service FEMI report, which had that fantastic graphic of the iceberg to talk about this, what we mean by infrastructure. It's not just the messaging and the content, although it matters. It's how certain messaging and certain content ends up in our feeds in front of our eyes. And that's the result of a massive infrastructure of voices, platforms, channels that work together to elevate that discourse. And, I don't think we should be replicating and doing exactly what authoritarians do. We have major advantages in that our values are human values. Our values align with what people actually care about. We're not trying to manipulate them to make decisions that are harmful for them. But we have to find a way to operate in a way that actually reaches folks. And I would argue that in many ways, we've lost that salience in recent years. So I know I have left starkly little time for Q&A, and I'm super sorry about that. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to pass it back to Maria with my deep apologies for being so long in the tooth.
No worries. We really enjoyed your presentation, Adam. Thank you so much. And I see that indeed on Slido we already have so many questions. Unfortunately, we will not be able to go through all of them, but let's start with a few. If my colleagues can share the Slido screen so everybody sees the question, but at the same time, all right, thank you. Very fast. So let's dig right into it. The first question is, by shutting down US information integrity infrastructure while authoritarians continue to scale theirs, what specific power vacuums are we creating, and who do you believe is the most likely to fill them in the next 12 to 24 months?
Well, a lot of my work recently has really focused again on the global majority contexts, on Latin America, and on Africa. I'm doing some work right now in East Asia as well. And it's my fear, and I think that fear is being played out, that the people who are doing this work, the people who care about this set of issues, have been defunded. It just means that they can't spend their day focused on it anymore for all that set of issues. And I think pardon me, that we should be tremendously concerned about that. Who will fill that power vacuum? I mean, we know from research that, pardon me, I keep burping here. We know that Russia has massively built out its architecture of RT, of sort of third-party, less than identifiable narratives through the doppelganger network that they're building out. That, of course, EU Disinfo has researched extensively. That they're building out their network of spoof web pages as well and news sources. So those are all tremendously concerning. The same for the PRC. They built out CGTN recently into a much larger, much more effective, information operation in a way. But who else fills it? I mean, domestic authoritarians, right? I mean, harmful information. Anyone who's trying to manipulate, all of a sudden they're facing much less opposition. They're probably not facing as many journalists, or at least as effective of teams that all of a sudden, may not have as many partners, right? So our ecosystem in many ways is falling apart. Um, Not everywhere, not all the time, but without that, many millions of dollars of U.S. support, folks simply can't do this work. So yeah, it's hard to say exactly who will be filling that space, but I think we can get a sense that it's folks who are networked, it's folks who are working together, and it's folks that don't necessarily have democratic values, right? So.
Yes, indeed. And how do we increase public awareness of the dangers of the duopoly that has formed between the current federal government and big tech oligarchs that is promoting authoritarianism and neo-reactionary and dark enlightenment ideologies? An easy question.
Ooh, yeah, easy one. No, I mean, it's just a little bit of what I was hitting at the end here, right? Which is that I think a lot of, we need to stop waiting for, the media, broadly speaking, to carry our voices, out to the public. They're being undermined. They're being shut down, even here in the States. And so I think we have to go direct to the public and try to rebuild salience around this issue. It's not easy. I don't think that's easy going out and fighting on this issue. Um, we have starkly few people now who are out doing this. Nina Jankowicz is one, Renee DiResta is another, Dean Jackson is another, who are really focused on the U.S. ecosystem. I think a lot of folks would love to be more engaged here. I just think we have to find a way to lower the barriers and make that easier, so that the pathway to doing that isn't kind of, well, what do I do? Where do I start? But that people have a better sense of what that looks like. And I think a lot of that, like I was saying, is lowering the barriers to entry for some of the essentially where discourse happens now, right? And that might be TikTok, it might be vertical video, and I think it's other spaces too. And we have to do that in a networked way. I think joint amplification is really critical. I would call that authentic coordinated behavior, and something that we should be thinking about and doing more of. Don't just put something out there. Tell your friends in your WhatsApp group or your Signal group, hey, I'm putting this up. Can everyone give us a quick like or or a retweet? Like that can be uncomfortable. It can feel like, clout chasing or something, but it's actually really critical. And it's really important that in the first hour, when your post goes up, that it gets engagement, because that's how the platforms decide what they're going to continue to amplify to larger and larger circles. So I don't think we should be scared about asking our friends, hey, can you folks give this a like and a tweet, etc. So yeah, that's a couple very much at the tactical level, but those are two things that I think can be helpful for us, in addition to that question of allied communities, right? Both the adjacent ones like the anti-corruption community, health, climate, those groups, but also the slightly more distant ones that might be harder and more difficult to engage. All the more important that we're finding ways to do that with the law enforcement community, with the national security community, and with the business community.
Definitely. I will join two questions together, one that you see on screen and other that you don't, but I think they're related, which is how likely is the Republican Party to continue beating the drum on the censorship industrial complex, given the actual censorship that the Trump administration is engaging in, and that the Republican Party is enabling, which is connecting to another question asked by Stephen about how much do these actors actually believe their own propaganda versus how are they exploiting it to rally for their base and make money. Of course, this leads to some degree of speculation, but I think you have the expertise to address that.
Yeah, they're very likely to continue beating the drum. The challenge is for our community is to just figure out how to depoliticize this issue, right? And say this should not be a political issue. This is something that we all care about, because we care about our families, we care about our communities, we care about our country, and we care about democracy. And so, I don't think it's otherworldly that we would find a way to re-engage on this. Part of our problem is that those voices have 5 megaphones in a row that are, screaming constantly from 10 different voices, all pushing them in a certain direction. I don't think that's unbeatable. In essence, I think that we just have to get out into the space and start trying. In many ways, our sector has not. And I don't think that's a political statement. I don't think that means we as a community should be campaigning or, advocating for certain candidates. But this issue is one that a lot of people care about, and a lot of people think is a big issue, and just don't know what to do on right now. And so I think part of it is getting more of us out there, getting more of us out there in ways that help amplify, our perspective on this issue and why it matters, and ensuring that we're working together as we do that. And then, sorry, what was the second question there?
I think you basically answered that, which was between how much this propaganda is actually believed in or it's motivated by some sort of ulterior motive of or interest.
Very,
I
very
think
hard to say.
you yes, you addressed that. So we are unfortunately running out of time. So let's take one final question, maybe ending on a more positive note. And the question is, if you had to propose one bold change to rebuild the field's long-term resilience, what would it be?
Ooh, one bold change. Um, $100 billion of funding for this work. I mean, that's the big one, right? Is that we're cannibalizing each other right now because of the lack of funding, and it needs to be the other way. And from a tactical standpoint, it's this question of existing and competing, in the modern information environment, which requires an infrastructure of support. Of collaboration, of data, of connection with partners, right? So those would be the two things. One is I would double, triple down on collaboration within countries, within regions, globally. The Disarm Foundation is to create an example of this. I think there's great examples from within Europe, like Alliance for Europe, among others, that are doing versions of this. That if you saw, Russia mentioned in an internal cable that they thought that the Alliance for Europe was a major threat to their interests because of their collaborative power. So those would be kind of the big ones for me, I would say.
Definitely, funding is a shared concern, I think, among our various communities. Adam, we are running out of time. I would like to thank you so much for such a interesting topic that really left us with a lot of questions, but also some answers and ways forward. I would like to also thank our attendees and my colleagues behind the scene, Anna, Haney, and Isabella, for making this webinar possible. As for the rest of the year, we have one more webinar to go on the 11th of December, as you can see on screen, and we encourage everyone who's interested to register. The recording for this webinar will be available soon on our YouTube channel and website, where you can also find all of our previous webinars. In case you haven't signed up yet, please do so for our bi-weekly newsletter. That's where we communicate about our webinars and a lot of other interesting initiatives. If you are not signed up, you're missing out. And at the end of this webinar, you will be presented with a feedback questionnaire. Please don't be shy, fill it. It takes a minute and it really helps us understand how to continue doing these things as good as possible, and to also receive recommendations for future topics. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Adam. This was amazing, and have a good rest of your days, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, folks. Thanks so much, Maria.
Thank you. Bye bye.